I never thought that my relationship with my brother could go this far. Jake is 3 years older, always charismatic but strangely demanding. In childhood, he knew how to win the respect of friends and teachers, but at home, he was a real despot. My mom, dad, and I often argued about his special position in the family, but back then I was too young to understand. This was laying the foundation for what happened later. It all started the day Jake first invited me into his room, closing the door. In his hands was a thick envelope with neat handwriting on the front. I immediately realized it wasn't a letter from the bank with some ad. "Listen," he said calmly, almost friendly. "I have a problem. Can you help?" I sat down on a chair, trying to figure out what he meant. "A problem," he said. But Jake's problems were never small. "How much?" I asked cautiously, bracing for the worst. He showed a figure that made me freeze. 5,000 euros. Not 1,000, not two, 5,000. My first reaction was, is this a joke? But in his eyes I saw steely calm, and it wasn't a joke. "Pay off my debts," he said softly, almost smiling, "or you're cut off from the family." My heart stopped for a moment. The phrase "cut off from the family" sounded terrifying, but I'd long since learned to separate emotional manipulation from reality. I laughed because what else was there to do? "Deal," I said, trying to stay composed. But inside, something broke. The laughter wasn't genuine. It was a weapon, a shield to hide the real horror. I knew this was the start of something much more complicated than a simple financial deal. A few days passed before I dared to look at the numbers Jake had mentioned. He led a life full of risks: card debts, loans for expensive gadgets, bets on sports events. It seemed like he never thought about the consequences, and now it all fell on my shoulders. I met up with friends at a cafe, trying to relieve the tension. "Is your brother out of his mind?" asked Liam, my best friend from childhood. "Looks like it," I replied, feeling the tightness in my chest grow. "And the weirdest part, he genuinely thinks I should pay it." "Are you seriously going to do it?" Liam raised his eyebrows. I paused. Honestly, I didn't know. On one hand, there was family, parents, moral responsibility. On the other, I was being literally blackmailed, and who knows where it would lead if I refused. That evening, I sat in my room going over options. Every scenario was awful. If I paid, it would just be the beginning. Jake wouldn't stop. If I didn't pay, I could lose contact with my relatives, and who knows what he'd do next. I closed my eyes and remembered childhood. When we were kids, Jake often took my toys, promising to return them but never doing so. I learned to endure, to swallow the insults. But now the stakes had grown to indecent levels. The next morning, I got a message from him. "Have you decided?" I opened the chat, my hands shaking. The response I typed was simple: deal. And that's where the real story begins. Because Jake didn't expect my game. He thought I'd be scared, sullen, and obedient. But I was ready for surprises. And then I started my plan, which even I didn't fully understand yet. In childhood, I often watched how our parents preferred to turn a blind eye to Jake's antics. Every time he yelled or threw tantrums, Mom would quietly leave the room, and Dad would try to find a compromise. This gave Jake the confidence that he could manipulate anyone. I remember the time when Jake took my first paycheck from a summer job, claiming it was teaching financial discipline. I believed him, and I was ashamed to tell our parents. They always called us close brothers, but in reality, their love was like a balance. Lots of freedom for the older one, and the expectation that the younger should be obedient. As an adult, I tried to distance myself. I studied abroad, worked on my career, made friends, and almost forgot about the childhood grievances. But Jake, he always found a way to come back. And now, after years, he showed up with a demand that turned everything upside down. I started analyzing. €5,000 was an amount I could earn in a few months of work, but it would be insane to spend it on someone else's debts. I understood that if I agreed, he'd see it as a rule, take without asking. And if I didn't agree, the consequences could be unpredictable. For several days, I watched him like an animal in a cage. He smiled, talked to our parents, pretended everything was calm. But his eyes betrayed nervousness. He realized I wouldn't be an easy player in his game. I started making a plan. I wasn't going to pay, but something inside whispered, act carefully. Jake was a master of manipulation, and any wrong move could turn into a disaster. I started keeping a diary, every message from him, every little thing, every manipulation I recorded. It was like psychological weaponry, preparation for a chess match. After I replied, deal, Jake seemed to relax. At first glance, he went back to his usual life, smiling at parents, joking with friends as if nothing happened. But I felt that this respite was just the beginning of the real game. He was waiting for the moment to test how ready I was to submit to his power. The first days after our agreement were quiet. I tried to focus on work studies, on not thinking about the debt. But every evening I caught myself wondering, what is he plotting? How will he blackmail me next? One evening I got a message. You know, family is everything, right? I felt a chill. This wasn't just brotherly talk. It was a threat carefully veiled as concern. I didn't reply, just observed. A few more days passed. My parents started noticing that I was acting strange. They asked if everything was okay, why I was stepping out so often, why I was so tense. I couldn't tell the truth. Saying Jake is blackmailing me meant dragging the family into a drama I had to resolve myself. And then one evening, Jake invited me to dinner. We sat at the table, parents talking about work and vacation plans, while Jake calmly watched me. His gaze was piercing, like a chess player evaluating an opponent. Have you thought about our conversation? He suddenly said. I pretended to be calm. Of course, I think it's all solvable. He smiled. It was a smile that meant nothing. It just conveyed, I know you're scared, but I'll test you. A few days later, I realized Jake was starting to act subtly. He asked me to help him with work, which was actually a meeting with his creditors. I understood it was a trap. If I refused, he'd portray me as ungrateful to the whole family. If I agreed, he'd drag me into his chaotic world. I tried to find support from friends. Liam listened to me for hours. You have to hold on, he said, but be careful, Jake won't stop. I understood this was just the beginning of a psychological war. Every call, every message from Jake was a potential blow. One day he showed up at my home unexpectedly. Mom had gone to the store, Dad was working late. He just stood at the door, smiling. Hey bro, he said, ready to discuss details. I felt adrenaline surge sharply. I realized that any move I made now could either destroy our bond or strengthen his power over me. We sat on the couch. He pulled out several envelopes with numbers scribbled in small handwriting. Each envelope was like a little bomb, ready to explode in my life. See these numbers, Jake said. Each one is your responsibility. I smiled, but inside rage boiled. How could he think I'd be scared? How could he use the family against me? Okay, I said quietly, let's start. And that's when the real game began. I started acting my own way. Every step of his I recorded, every call, every message. I built a strategy as if we were playing chess. But chess with Jake was deadly dangerous. One wrong move and the stakes skyrocketed. A week later, I started acting. I negotiated with creditors, figured out debt details, found weak points in his arguments. Jake thought he controlled the situation, but in reality, he was just pushing me to prepare a trap for him. This part of the story was meant to show. Tension is rising. The reader starts worrying for the narrator, understanding that an inevitable conflict and possible consequences lie ahead. The day after I started recording all of Jake's calls and messages, he suddenly showed up at my office. I was sitting at my desk, buried in papers, when I heard a quiet knock on the door. "Bro, I have a new proposal," he said, entering and smiling. His gaze was cold as steel. I noticed his hand twitch involuntarily toward his bag. Jake loved showing he was armed with information. In his bag were papers, photos, debt lists, everything he could use against me. "Listen," he said, "there are people you can help. Small amounts, nothing complicated. But keep in mind, this affects your reputation in the family." I nodded, pretending to be scared. In reality, a strategy was forming inside me. I wasn't going to just pay. I was going to play by my own rules. The first days were harder than I expected. Every call from him, every visit, it was like psychological pressure. But I started noticing patterns. Jake tried to intimidate me, but he did it the same way, almost templated. "You understand that family is the most important," he would say, trying to evoke guilt. I stayed silent. I wasn't going to give him what he wanted, emotions. One evening, Mom noticed I looked tired and tense. "What's going on with you?" she asked. "You barely eat, don't sleep properly." I couldn't tell the truth. Saying Jake is blackmailing me meant pulling the family into a storm I had to control myself. At that moment, I realized, if I lost, the consequences would be devastating. Jake could destroy my reputation in the family, make our parents think I was ungrateful and selfish. I started acting subtly. I met with his creditors under the guise of a random consultant. I recorded every conversation, gathered evidence, understood Jake's weak spots. He thought he controlled the situation, but in reality, he was preparing information I could use against him. And then came the day when Jake and I were supposed to meet for the handover of the first part of the debt. I prepared everything in advance: papers, numbers, evidence that could put him in an awkward position if he tried to threaten. When he entered, I met his gaze. He didn't expect such preparedness. "Everything ready?" he asked, trying to hide the tension. I nodded and handed over the papers. But inside, everything boiled. This wasn't just a deal, it was a game of survival. "Look closely," I said quietly. "We document every step." He froze. His usual smile vanished, leaving only cold surprise. At that moment, I realized the game was just beginning and the stakes would only rise. I was no longer just a victim. I had become a player. And in this game, losing meant losing more than money. After the first deal, I tasted control. Jake was surprised that I could prepare and not succumb to pressure. He clearly expected me to give in after the first threats and blackmail. But now the game had changed. Every message from him, every call, I documented. I understood that Jake relied on fear, and the harder he pushed, the more mistakes he made. "You know, bro," he said one day, entering my office, "if you don't pay in full, you can forget about the family forever." I raised an eyebrow and smiled. "Are you sure you want this to go public?" He froze. His usual confidence started crumbling. I wasn't showing fear. I wasn't giving in to his emotions, and that angered him the most. The next day, I arranged a casual meeting with his creditors. I wasn't going to pay anything directly, but I started building a network of evidence of his debts, threats, and manipulations. Files, recordings, chats, all of it was now on my computer. Jake noticed the change. He started being cautious, trying to hide his actions, but it was too late. I controlled the information. "Are you setting me up?" he asked once over the phone, his voice trembling. "No, bro," I said calmly. "Just documenting facts." Every move of his I turned into evidence against him, but I didn't rush to publish anything. This was the moment when I could make him admit his mistakes or lose everything. Mom and Dad noticed changes in our family dynamic. They saw the tension between us but didn't understand the full depth of the conflict. I decided not to involve them directly. The less they knew, the fewer risky mistakes. One evening, Jake tried to set up an unexpected meeting to discuss resolving the debt. I agreed but prepared a strategy. I recorded all conversations on a hidden device, invited a lawyer who was to be present under the guise of a casual acquaintance. When Jake entered, I noticed his nervousness. He already understood that control was slipping away. "You want this to be civilized," I said quietly, "or shall we continue in the legal field?" He froze. Fear flashed in his eyes, a rare moment when Jake was vulnerable. That evening, I realized the key to victory was patience and strategy. Jake never expected someone from the family could play by their own rules. And now I had a trump card that could change our family's dynamic forever. My entire strategy was now aimed at one moment. Jake had to feel that his game was over. I kept all the evidence to myself, but their weight pressed on him invisibly. "I can resolve everything peacefully," I said one day, sitting at the table in the living room, "but only if you're honest." He froze. His usual self-confidence started breaking down. I saw how every breath betrayed his inner struggle. He understood he'd lost, but pride wouldn't let him surrender completely. That day, I met with the lawyer to discuss filing official complaints about all of Jake's debt schemes. We carefully checked every document, every financial flow. This was a game where the stakes were too high to make a mistake. When Jake realized I was ready to act, he tried using old tricks, threats, manipulations, attempts at intimidation. But now I saw right through him. I didn't give in to emotions. Every step of his only strengthened my position. "Do you really think you can stop me?" he asked with desperation in his voice. "No, bro," I replied calmly. "I'm just going to show everyone who you really are." The next day, we met with his creditors. I pretended to come to help, but in reality, I provided them with full data on his schemes. Some of them started whispering right in front of him, his authority crumbling before his eyes. That evening, Jake tried to set up a final conversation with our parents. He hoped they'd take his side. But Mom and Dad had already noticed his deceit and aggression. Their views on the situation changed, and that was my small but powerful triumph. "We're tired of the constant pressure, Jake," Mom said quietly. "It's time to take responsibility for your actions." His face paled. I saw him realize the scale of his isolation. His attempts at manipulation now hit an impenetrable wall of logic and evidence. In the end, I offered him one option: honest admission of debts and a public apology to the family. He hesitated but understood there was no choice left. "Okay," he whispered, "I'll do it." I nodded, understanding that the long path of struggle had ended. Jake was defeated not by threats or force, but by strategy, patience, and attention to details. The family began to recover after the shock, trust returning gradually. And I realized that sometimes strength lies not in shouting louder or paying more, but in controlling the situation quietly, confidently, and wisely.